so much for telling us such an interesting story. I think that is going to stimulate a lot of discussion. I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question just to remind you that there are question cards at your places, and there are volunteers who are going to come to the front with microphones. So just hold up your hand or your question card. First, I have a couple of questions that have already been submitted, and the first one is, you have spent a lot of time looking at historical examples, and now we'd like you to look into your crystal ball. So looking into the crystal ball in the Arab world with the uprisings that are happening there, what do you predict will happen, and do you think that the rebellious, the protesters, are going to find legitimacy?
Wow. I mean, that's in one way, all I can venture is an uninformed opinion, since I don't know if I know anyone any better than anyone else. I worry about that. I can't say that I'm an optimist, and I say that because I think one of the things that we have learned in recent years is that building a sustainable, legitimate democracy is one of the single hardest things that any society does. And I think those of us who are fortunate enough to live in democracies that work and that do grant their people legitimacy sometimes take that accomplishment for granted. And we think, oh, it's easy. You know, you vote every 4 years, and whatever you do, and it's not easy at all. And we spent a long time, the society of which we're all a part, spent, if we go back to England and beyond, spent many centuries working it out, right? Figuring out how to do it. And this country itself went through an extraordinary number of growing pains in trying to figure out how to build a legitimate government in a country that had two very different cultures in the beginning, right? It was tough. We're still working on it, right? And so it's asking a lot, I think, for countries that have not even a shred of those systems in place to build them overnight. It's going to be very difficult, particularly when they are competing with a religious culture, which does not grant legitimacy to 50% of its adherents, right? Can't even drive if you're a woman in a lot of those countries. So, I mean, that's also a big hurdle. How do you make the argument for legitimacy in the face of a culture that feels very strongly that only half of its citizens ought to be treated as real human beings? So that's, I think that's a struggle. And I think China is going to figure out how hard it is too. For all of the extraordinary things they have accomplished economically over the last 25 years, they haven't tackled the hard problem. They haven't tackled at all, right? It's easy to build bridges and roads and umbrella factories if you have a command economy and a lot of money and a lot of cheap labor. It is not easy to build a democracy that leaves people feeling heard and satisfied at the end of the day. And they're going to discover, I think, just how difficult that is.
So a lot of people's attention is focused on China. Do you think that is enough to stop or slow down their growth? And how would you compare that to what might be happening in India?
I'm way more bullish, on India than I am on China, because I think India has solved the hard problem. They have a flawed but functioning democracy, and have had it for a long time, and a pretty resilient one, by the way, a pretty amazing one. And I think that gives them a reasonable basis of social stability from which to tackle all kinds of other problems. And also, there are a number of other reasons why I like India more than China, in terms of future prospects, demographic reasons and such. But that would be the main reason. And I think that the threat of major social instability ought to loom large in any future estimation of China? Totally. Are you kidding me? To any company that has 100% of their manufacturing exposure in China, I would say you're crazy. Totally crazy. Could all blow up tomorrow. That the people are seduced by the fact that it is momentarily cheaper. And, the phrase I love is that people, all of us, we misprice stability. We just don't. We don't take stability and legitimacy are things that the value of which we radically underestimate.
Right? I've got a couple of new questions here. I'll answer this one. I'll ask this one first. If you think about rebels in business, can you talk about the link between rebels or the relationship of rebels within businesses and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think that there's a wonderful phrase, I've forgotten the exact quote from George Bernard Shaw about how progress depends on the unreasonable man. That there is, and this is a big theme of my new book, I talk a lot about how entrepreneurs have many traits, the good ones. They're obviously smart, they're driven, they're creative, they're conscientious, but what they really are is disagreeable, right? They are unreasonable people. They look at the world and they say, I don't want to do it that way.
Is there anyone unreasonable here in the crowd?
I think there's a fair number unreasonable. And, it's why, when you read that biography of Steve Jobs, which I'm in love with at the moment, he's a profoundly disagreeable man. He doesn't care what the world thinks, right? He's a very specific idea about what he would like to accomplish, and if he tramples on all kinds of people's toes in the pursuit of that notion, he didn't care. Now, does that mean that I want to work for him? No, I don't want to work for him, but I'm very happy he exists, right? And some people can deal with that, right? I mean, only a small number of people could make it at Apple. I mean, the turnover there was quite dramatic. But the people who did make it, by the way, are pretty spectacular. But he's a good example of you need that. You want to create something in a complex marketplace of enduring value. You have to have, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're starting from scratch, sometimes you have to have a kind of disagreeable, rebellious streak in you. And the great ones often do.
Not surprisingly, I have a number of questions about the Occupy movement, so I'll try to combine them a little bit. Is the Occupy Wall Street movement the start of the U.S. version of the Arab Spring?
No, but that doesn't mean it's trivial. So America is not a tyrannical dictatorship, right? It's a functioning democracy, and so the scale of the grievance is somewhat less. But the Occupy movement is, I think, potentially the start of something interesting and significant and appropriate. I think that, and this is something that's true of the United States and not Canada. The United States has gone, I think, rather badly off the rails in the last 15 years, in some ways, principally in the area of income inequality and social mobility. America has gone from being the most socially mobile major economy in the world to one of the least. There's wonderfully specific ways of measuring this. Compared to Canada, for example, social mobility in America is a fraction of what it is in this country. It is very, very hard to move, almost impossible now to move from the bottom to the middle in America, and almost impossible to move from the middle to the top. You can move around the middle. That's about it now. The only major Western democracy that is less socially mobile than America is England, and England's never been very socially mobile, right? And that's a problem. And to the extent that the Occupy movement is concerned in trying to address that fact, I think I'm absolutely behind them and hope that they turn into something more powerful and coherent. Unfortunately, at the moment, their message has not been refined, and they have not developed into a coherent movement. They're still something very amorphous. But it's early yet. Major social movements take a long time. Last time I was reading about, Fidel Castro's revolution in Castro. It took 15 years beginning to end. He starts organizing when he's in law school. He didn't take over until, the beginning of the 60s. There's a good 15 years of like running around the mountains and organizing and taking off to Mexico City, and there's all kinds of stuff. So when you say that Occupy, are they there yet? Well, of course not, but they've only been around for 6 months. So I'd come back and let's talk about it in 3 years.
Maybe we will. We'll have you back. Please comment, there's a couple of questions similar. Please comment on how large a minority on either end of the spectrum within U.S. politics does not recognize the legitimacy of the other side.
Wow, I think it's about 50-50 right now. It's impossible, if you don't live in America every day, to understand the depth of the dysfunction right now in the political system. It really is, and I say this not in a partisan way, although I am on one side of the aisle on these questions, but leave that aside. Literally, there is no dialogue whatsoever between the two parties. Congress is essentially ground to a halt. There's only one thing that Congress has agreed on, a substantial thing that they've agreed on over the last 2 years, and that is that they decided a couple weeks ago that for the purposes of federal regulations, they would consider pizza to be a vegetable. That's it. Right? And that's pretty sobering. When that's the basis, when that's all you can kind of, come home at night, Daddy, what did you do today in Congress? Well, we finally made some progress on the pizza as vegetable front. If that's all you can say to your kids at the end of the day, you got a problem. And I don't know, I don't see any. It is very, very terrifying to see the kind of breakdown. And I can give you, I have many theories about why, but I won't go into them because they're.
To change directions a little bit, so can you talk about your theory of rebellion, and does it scale down right into the family unit? Does it explain teenage rebellion?
Oh, interesting.
Do we have any teen people who were rebellious when they were teenagers here?
Sure. I mean, well, I was going to say there's a couple of interesting things about this. So I'll answer a slightly different question first, and then I'll get to that. So in thinking about the failures of deterrence, so all these people say, the deterrence model, why doesn't deterrence work the way it's supposed to work? So why, when I ratchet up the penalties for drug dealing, doesn't drug dealing go away? Think about it. If I catch you dealing crack in any American city, I can put you behind bars for 25 years. You'd think that should stop someone from wanting to deal crack, but it doesn't. Right? Why not? Well, there's a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is that there are 3 elements to deterrence. There is the certainty of the punishment, the speed of the punishment, and the severity of the punishment. Certainty, celerity, severity. Right? And of those 3, the most important is certainty, the likelihood you'll get caught. The second most important is speed, celerity, the time that elapses between when you do the thing that's wrong and the punishment. The least important is severity. Right? What America has done in the last 25 years is to define deterrence entirely in terms of severity. They haven't done anything about the certainty. Your odds of getting caught dealing crack are per transaction. People have actually worked it out. 1 in 2,500. Not large. In other words, if any of you would like to go home and deal some crack, you're not going to get caught. Nor did anything about the speed of enforcement. A huge time lapse, there's a huge lapse in time between when you get arrested and when you get convicted, if you do. All they've done is tinker with the weakest of the 3, which is severity. So think about this with respect to your kid. Your kid does something wrong. You know this. You know that the single most important thing is to make sure that punishment reliably follows infractions. That if you don't want your kid to throw things at you, you have to make sure that every time they throw things at you, you punish them, right? It's the first thing you do. The second thing is, it has to be right away. You can't wait a month to punish them. You can't say, you're having a timeout now for something that you did in the beginning of October. Actually, October 6th. And it doesn't work, right? You know this. But the last thing you mess with is you don't play with severity at all. You don't say, and if you throw 2 things at the wall, I'm going to take, 1 thing at the wall is a timeout for 10 minutes, 2 things is a timeout for 12 hours, and if you throw 3 things at the wall, I'm going to string you up by your fingernails, right, and waterboard you until you... No, you don't do that. You know that the things that matter are certainty and speed, right? Yet, why? So everyone knows this. Fundamental principle deterrence. That's how you get your kid to behave, right? So how come we know this as parents, and yet when it comes to society, all we do is think about severity, right? As I understand it, your sainted prime minister has all kinds of ideas for increasing...
tricky territory here.
to increasing punishments for crime. And let me tell you, that's crazy. I can line up 100 criminologists who will tell you, you may want to decrease crime. Absolutely, do it. And you may want to tinker with the criminal justice system to do it. Fine. But the one thing that will not work is increasing penalties for crimes. That's the dumbest of the 3, right? Why don't you work on certainty? That's a good thing to work on. Like, why don't you work on celerity? Let's make it really quick. In the 1930s in England, if you were convicted of a crime, they had the death penalty back then, before they got rid of actually in the 20s, before they got rid of the death penalty in England. If you were convicted of murder, you were, I think this is right, you were dead within 2 weeks. That's celerity. That's
that's
they're
quick.
not messing around, right? That's a deterrent. So that would be my little minor advice to your sainted prime minister.
I was just going to say on the waterboarding comment too, we like debate and discussion, and for anybody who was here in September when we had Dick Cheney, I'm just thinking, take some of his comments and put him here and Malcolm here, and it's a debate that's just ranged over a longer period of time than debates normally do, just sort of 2 months there. So a question about the U.S. financial markets. It awards short-term goals hugely while undermining our socioeconomic systems on which our society was built. Where do you see the tipping point? What will trigger reform?
Well, I would have thought we would have had a tipping point in 2008. I mean, if you had to engineer a crisis that you would have thought would bring about fundamental reform, you would have drawn up something like what happened a couple years ago in subprime, right? I mean, this close to a complete meltdown. As someone, I went to some conference and some senior finance guy on Wall Street said, in the most chilling thing I think I've ever heard, he said, we were this close to money not coming out of the ATM the next day, right? So, I mean, if you go that close to the precipice and you still can't do fundamental reform, I give up. I don't know what it takes. I don't know why people are still, I don't know whether I don't get the sense that the fundamental issues have been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. I don't know why. I mean, a thoroughly legitimate response, I would have thought in 2008 would be to say, and I'm not just playing to the crowd here, though I am playing to the crowd. We, America, our banks nearly went to the brink of ruin. Our neighbor to the north, banks did not. Why don't we just do what they did when it comes to banking? I don't know. The idea that you would look at someone who does something well and copy it, is that a crazy idea? I mean, it doesn't seem to have occurred to anyone in Washington. Maybe they feel bad about copying things that Canadians do. Maybe they felt that would mean they'd have to get NHL franchises, and I don't know. I mean, but it's weird to me, this kind of indifference. If you're in the private sector and you're a company, you benchmark your competitors, right? You actively look at what they're doing and you steal the things that work, right? That's what you do. Why should it be, once again, goes back to the theme I was making before. Why is there a disconnect between the way people behave in the public sector and the way they behave in the rest of their lives, right? It's not a different universe. It's the same universe. People are still people. You had a set of principles.
You haven't been to Ottawa then if you don't think it's a separate universe there.
No, it is. I mean, it is. If you follow a set of principles for disciplining your children, why do you think those principles would be different when you discipline criminals in the real world? It's the same thing. You're trying to do the same thing, right? So why do you abandon everything that you've learned in one realm when you move into the next. I don't understand that.
We're going to go to a live question.
I'd like to ask if you think America has given up on its quest for legitimacy. It strikes me that it was a country that was born of that, trying to rebel against the oppression of England, and yet they seem lost. Or do you think it's simply a process due to paralysis from partisanship?
Yeah. I would never say they've given up. I think that fundamentally the American people are as decent as everyone in this room. I don't think there's anything wrong with the character and values of the vast majority of Americans. I think that they are simply in a situation right now where they have a massively dysfunctional political system, and where a very, very small number of ideological zealots have hijacked the process for their own ends. But I have faith that that will pass. And if it doesn't, I'm going to move back to Canada. I still have my passport, and I will. But I think you have to be optimistic. I mean, I don't think you can write them off, and I think there are enough decent-minded people out there that.
Can I ask you, you hinted about Guantanamo, I thought, obliquely. Is it being spoken of at all, or is everything frozen?
Is what being spoken of? Guantanamo?
Guantanamo.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, you're the ones who heard Dick Cheney not long ago. I would have loved to be there. I would have been the one outside with the handcuffs waiting to put them on him when he came out the door. But he, I mean, ask him. I mean, I don't hear a lot of talk about that. I don't get a sense that, I get a sense that anything, that they had a perspective that anything goes. That all these crazy ideas about torture. By the way, let me just say this about Dick Cheney since he's not here. On the narrow question of torture, let's talk about torture for a moment. This is a very good test of this. We all agree that on a moral level, torture is fundamentally illegitimate, right? But the justification is made by some, such as my predecessor in this chair, that it was justified in that instance because America was facing a grave peril and because it was useful. Right? It helped to get at important truths. So then the question is, okay, how do you know it's useful? Right? How do you know that the kind of information you get from torture is something that is trustworthy and of practical value in the war against terror? And he will say, well, I know, because we all got all kinds of great stuff. He'll say, all right, no, that's not good enough. Right? Can you give me any evidence? Is there, in fact, have there been studies of the usefulness of torture over the years? And the answer is yes. Lots of studies, not just lots of studies, tons of studies. I had a conversation not long ago with someone from the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation is the think tank that the Pentagon itself started to investigate questions such as this. All of the heavy-hitting things they want resolved, they give to a bunch of people in Santa Monica, who, by the way, are the smartest group of people you will ever meet in your entire life, right? Totally brilliant. And is it a bunch of wishy-washy liberals? No. It's the most hard-nosed, if anything, they are on the right side of the equation. Okay, so I was talking not long ago to the terrorism person at RAND, and I said, what do we know about how effective the information is that you get from torture? And this woman said to me, oh, we know a lot. I said, what do we know? She said, it's absolutely useless. We've known this for years. She says, I can give you a stack of studies this high that will say that you cannot trust a single bit of information that you extract from someone under torture. Why? Because they'll tell you anything under torture, right? It's useless. Got to start over. And when we find good information, we get it some other means. In other words, at that moment where they chose to do this thing that was completely illegitimate, their justification was utterly baseless. And so why did they do that? Because they were uninterested in a justification. They never, to the extent that either they didn't bother to read all those studies, or they read them and they said, we don't care. I want to do it anyway. Now, it's that part of the behavior that I find completely reprehensible, that no elected official, no member of a legitimate government anywhere in a democratic society should ever do that, should ever embark on something that morally questionable in the face of evidence from their own government that what they're doing is not just immoral, but completely useless, right? That's where I just say, you have gone off the reservation. So in answer to your question, no, there is not enough discussion about what goes on there. And history will judge the Bush administration and Mr. Cheney himself so harshly on this. Just wait, right? Books will be written about what a war criminal that guy is. I feel very, very strongly about that, as you can tell. So yeah, this is exactly the moment where we have to stand up and say, what values exactly do we stand for? And unless those values make a material difference in how you choose to conduct yourself as an elected official, you don't belong in politics, right?
Well, I think that's a great theme because now we have a question about the tortuous European economy. Can we segue into something tortuous here? Speaking of the failure of rising deterrence, how does the German Chancellor's method of forcing more pain on the peripheral European countries, Greece, Italy, etc., rate in terms of an effective strategy?
Oh dear, that may be out of my. That's out of my depth, I'm afraid. I don't know enough about the particulars of the Euro crisis to weigh in on that one.
Oh, okay. I've got it. Well, I promised to read this question, although you may have the same answer. And I'm pretty sure that no matter who we have as a speaker, we're going to get the same question because it's Calgary, and this is obviously an important issue. So you have to weigh in. Not just on who you think should have won the football game on Sunday, but which option is better, exporting oil sands oil through Keystone to the U.S. or oil to China via a pipeline to the West Coast? There's a right answer and a wrong. We'll take a vote here in the room.
Yes, I was going to say, can we go to vote first, and then I'll cast.
Would you like to phone a friend?
Yes, that's right. Do I have a?
Anyway, that might be an interesting conversation for us to have outside. There's bright lights. If I've got two last questions here. If there's anybody else who'd like the microphone, please wave your hand. We have the volunteers. If not, I will go to the last two questions. So what about social conditions, social determinants that lead to crime, deviance, and choices? What is your theory of legitimacy? What do you feel is legitimate?
Yeah. That's a really wonderful and an enormous question. What I guess I would say is when it comes to the criminal justice system, what we need to do is to restore some sense of legitimacy to the process of punishment. So here's a very simple, there's a whole group, a movement among criminologists towards what's called restorative justice. And so one of the things in restorative justice is they feel it's very, very important that after someone is convicted of a crime, they are required to sit down with the victims of the crime, right? To meet them face to face and to understand the consequences of their action, right? And that's important for a number of reasons. One is that it grants legitimacy to the victim. It allows the victim to be heard, because in the process now, victims are the forgotten people, right? The whole process revolves around the criminal, and the person who has suffered the most is often left out of the. And we have to remember the point of the criminal justice system is not just to punish the criminal; it is to restore the victim. Right? And so that's something I think is a really powerful idea that, when it has been tested, has proven to be enormously important, not just for the psychological health of victims, but also for the attitudes of the criminals, that we see much lower recidivism rates among criminals who are forced to confront what they've done, to realize that. So that's one thing. Another thing is that there's been another movement that has that says, look, the real reason why people obey the law is not because of the law. It's because they live in communities which have values and norms which affect them, right? The reason you don't go home and beat your kids is not because there's a law that says you can't beat your kids. It's because you live in a community and you have a set of values that says that's wrong. It's unthinkable, right? So the real task of, if you think about, so that's in a sense that that the power of the sanction, don't beat your kids, doesn't rely in some abstract statue somewhere. It relies in the community. It's something that we built. All of us in this room built that notion, that norm, right? So we should spend much more time building those norms. So there's a really wonderful program, for example, in New York where when they work with young offenders and they work with people who've been convicted of one crime, and what they do is they go to their mothers or their grandmothers. Typically, these are people from single-parent homes, and they sit down with them and they make the kid sit down with their community, their mother, grandparents, friends of their mothers, and they force them to listen to what their community says about what they've done. If they've been convicted of shooting someone, if they have been dealing drugs, if they need to know not just what does the law say about that, but what do people in my world say about that? And what they realize is way more important and powerful to hear from people in your world, to understand that if you're some dumb gangbanger going out there doing some crazy thing, you're not just violating the abstract law downtown put together by someone you've never met. You are directly affecting and harming and angering people that you care about, right? And that sounds like an incredibly simple thing. We have seen dramatic decreases in criminality after we do those kinds of interventions, family interventions. And that's about legitimacy. It's about understanding that getting people to obey authority requires us to build a supportive social structure around them. Those are really simple things, but that's where I'd like to see the criminal justice system move, to start thinking much more broadly about anchoring behavior in the broadest possible social context. And by the way, those things that I've described are incredibly cheap. They are. That is a lot cheaper than putting someone in a cell for a year. Trust me, it's 1/100th of the cost. And thankfully, I think we're beginning to see that kind of movement.
So just to the final question then, to bring the conversation back to leadership. We have a room full of business leaders and community leaders. What are a few things that you could talk about so that people will understand the role that they can take as leaders within their companies and within their communities? What are some of the most poignant examples of great leadership that you could recommend or talk about?
Yeah. Well, I was just having this conversation at dinner. I think it says about people that the primary responsibility of leaders is to build organizations and cultures that are founded on those principles, on the principles of treating people with respect, with fairness, and building systems, cultures that are trustworthy, that are not arbitrary, that have a clear set of principles, that don't deviate from one day to the next, and that don't play favorites, and that give, those are really kind of dumb, obvious things, but when you realize that is at the core of what really motivates behavior, then I think that we were just having with John just having this discussion at dinner about how do you behave when the economy turns down and you have to make a decision. Do you lay people off, or do you keep them on and sacrifice in the short term your profits? And that's more than simply an economic decision, right? That's a decision that reflects the values of your organization. And those values, if you allow your values to be compromised in those difficult moments, you will have a hard time building a culture of legitimacy when times are good, right? That's when you're tested as an organization. And I think there's something, these kinds of principles, I think, almost apply more to companies, because companies are the most, for many of us, they're the most direct and meaningful way in which we interact with other people, right? That's where we learn things like how do we treat each other and what are the principles on which we want our society to operate. So I think, when leaders, And I think the newest sort of generation of leaders are learning these lessons. I think the quality of leadership is better today than it was in the past. People are aware of these kinds of things. So I'm optimistic on that front.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed one question there at the back, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, I was just wondering, going back to your talk about the Arab Spring, so to speak. The social networking, Facebook, Twitter, things like that seemed to have a great deal of effect on the organization of that. And considering how repressive those regimes are, do you think that this type of electronic media could be a further impetus for rebellion, change, and more egalitarian societies? The development of a democratic meme, which they're missing right now.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a tool, an organizational tool, and an important one. But you know, when you look at successful social movements, they need to add so much more. They need to build. You need to have coherent message. You need to have some kind of organization, more than simply a loose conglomeration of kind of people linked by weak ties. You need to have some kind of very coherent organization where people are genuinely committed to what you're doing. And you need to have strategic direction. You know, I read right around the time of all the Arab Spring stuff, I was going back and reading a lot about the civil rights movement in the United States. And it is useful to remind yourself just what an incredibly tightly run, highly organized, hierarchical, strategically sophisticated movement that was. That was more than people marching in the streets. That was a tightly run organization, and at the head was a guy named Martin Luther King, who was as brilliant a strategist as a social movement has ever had, and who ruled that movement with an iron fist, right? You did things according to a very specific schedule, according to a carefully thought out strategy. I mean, every single thing they were doing was thought out in advance. And that's very different from the model that we're using now, that is being used in some of these incipient social movements. And I wonder whether, to be truly effective over the long term, these movements that have been started using social media need to move in that direction. They need to develop a whole series of things outside of that, of the kind of connectedness of social media. You know, if Occupy is going to be powerful, they're going to have to get leadership and strategy and hierarchy and organization. You can only go so far with these kinds of weak tie. I'm using weak tie in the kind of formal sense of that word. These kind of loosely connected organizations mediated through social media. So you have to take, I think, the next step to be influential.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for spending the evening with us and giving us so many interesting ideas to discuss going forward. Thank you.